Welcome back to Breaking the Law. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Our approach is simple. The traditional model of law is breaking people. And because the traditional approach to law is broken, it's time to break free from the law, as it's been practiced for, frankly, a really, really long time. Today, we're taking a deeper dive into how the traditional approach to law is broken. We're really grateful today to be joined again by Danielle Hall and my co-host, Ashlyn Lindskog, and I'm Sam Foreman. I'm Ron Burgundy. No, I'm not. Can we edit that out? Don't do it. Leave it in there.
Burgundy.
Our podcast does not smell of rich mahogany and many leather-bound books, but we promise you that we have a lot of good things to talk about today. Mm-hmm. Danielle, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've observed through your work with the Kansas Lawyers Assistance Program, the Institute for Wellbeing in the Law, and the many other activities that you're involved with. What are some of the things that you've seen that really help you feel like you can start to see, okay, here's what might be broken that's causing some of these, negative outcomes that we've talked about? So we've talked on other episodes about, mental health, substance abuse, burnout. We've talked about the impact on, family relationships and other things, but, all of those come from someplace. And so when you think about, hey, the traditional approach to law might be broken or it is broken, what are some of the things that you're observing?
Yeah, I think through conversation and discussion, which, by the way, has increased dramatically, I think for a number of different reasons, one being the well-being movement itself, but you throw in there the perfect storm of a pandemic and people start talking about their mental health more, mm-hmm. and these discussions become more prominent, and that has made its way as well into the practice of law. But through those conversations, what has a tendency to come up is just some of the things that, we've already talked about on some of our episodes with the traditional way that law is practiced, right? The focus on billables, on the money aspect side of things, that also some of our obligations that we create as it relates to our clients due to a lack of boundaries. Mm-hmm. So there's some individual aspect there that also has a tendency to play a role, particularly when we're talking about things like overwhelm and burnout and high levels of stress that we see within the practice of law. But then you have this aspect of longstanding traditions, longstanding culture of just how we have modeled firm life, and mm-hmm. even to some degree how the law is even practiced in legal aid agencies as well as government agencies. It's just this traditional aspect, our approach that, might have worked at one point in time. But I think what we are slowly seeing, or maybe more quickly seeing now than we have before, is that it's impacting people in not the greatest of ways, mm-hmm. particularly when we don't have mechanisms in place to assist people who are struggling, because that's the other component of this that I see, right? We can identify the issues that people are dealing with and the struggles that they are seeing due to the way that the law is practiced. But when you couple that then without providing them the resources necessary to implement good coping mechanisms, to make those changes or empower them to do something as simple as putting into place boundaries, then we create these environments in which people really want to thrive, but they don't have the resources to actually thrive. And I think that those are the conversations that we are starting to have as individuals and as a lawyer population in what we want to see in the practice of law.
No, that's great. That's great. When you think about, because we've talked about kind of working definitions of a traditional approach to law on our initial episode, but some of the things that that I think of when I think about the traditional model of law, just so that folks that are listening or watching will follow along with that, I think of something where the economic model is dominated by the billable hour. That's really the king, where the hero, if you will, of the traditional law model is the workaholic. It's somebody who's idolized for how many hours they're able to get, how much money they're able to exchange that time for. The King of Workaholic Mountain, which is a board game. We'll definitely talk about launching, but never actually do.
Patent pending.
Working on it. Where culture, internal culture is image driven. There's huge amounts of pressure for people to perform, to fit in, to fit the part, to look the part, where individuality is not something that's valued or embraced. There's a one size fits all dynamic to most things. Comp structures, in addition to prizing the billable hour above all else, comp structures are frequently, in addition to being one size fits all in many cases, while people are associates and incentivizing people to become workaholics, as people progress through their careers, they're often black box type of things where people don't know how their comp is going to be generated or how their comp is going to be determined. It's going to be some committee sitting in a room, without enough input, without any kind of transparency or predictability, determining what these people are going to make or what their share of it's going to be in the next year based on not necessarily merit or things that people can control, but based off of other factors. So I think those are some of the things that I think of that we've talked about a bit, in terms of traditional law. Does that fit with what you think about when you think about traditional law, or what other items would you add to that?
Yeah, that definitely are some of the big highlights that I think about when you talk about traditional law. But I also think about it from the perspective of solos and smalls, kind of that concept and mentality of you eat what you kill, right? You got to have the ability to keep the lights on. So just as maybe we see at a large firm level, the focus on billable hours, when it comes to our solos and smalls, they're focused on keeping the lights on and ensuring that they can pay their bills and they can survive at the end of the day. And so that kind of focus in looking at it from a traditional sort of perspective even gets those folks into that atypical grind that we see when it comes to the practice of law.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we talk a lot, or I have a tendency to talk a lot about big law and to get lazy in my conversation and almost treat big law as being synonymous with traditional law. And I think almost across the board, big law does embrace traditional law, but not entirely. And nobody probably entirely fits that definition of traditional law. But I think it's really important, as you've done, to note that traditional law is independent of the size of the firm. Solos and smalls can be just as a part of traditional law as a big law firm, and being part of a smaller law firm or a solo doesn't mean that you're free from those pressures or from the pain that model can create.
When I was looking at starting a law firm and interviewing and talking to other people about what that might feel like or look like, some of the advice I got was, even when things are good, you're not, struggling to keep the lights on. When money is coming in and it is, you realize, well, if I just give 3 more hours today, then it's even, I can almost get it down to a dime what I'm going to make. And it's almost still that same drive, even though it's just you looking at you, to say, well, I could produce more. I could aim higher. I could do more. And I'll just skip this one basketball game or whatever it is to get this extra money or do those things. I think the practice of law, the time value connection, that we make money by giving our time away, I think sort of drives that across firm size problem. You have to be very intentional about not, giving it all away, for sure.
One thing I think that really well, or that at least when I think about it, illustrates really well what's broken about the law is the situation that mothers find themselves in, trying to be active practitioners in the law. There's a really great article that we'll link to regarding an ABA study on the impact that motherhood has on attorneys. I'll just hit a couple of high points here. But it talks about the double burden that a lot of women feel. And it's causing a lot of mothers to leave the practice of law altogether, but in particular to leave a lot of firms because there isn't a space where they feel like they can fit in and where they can thrive. This quote jumped out to me a lot in the article. I left private practice 17 years ago after having my first child because I was forced to prove whether I would prioritize work over being a mom. And that just breaks my heart. I mean, thinking about the culture and the model that firms have embraced to where somebody would even think that that's appropriate. That what I need to do to protect myself, to protect my firm, is I need to go to this person that's just brought a human being into the world, and to ask them where their loyalty lies. Some other highlights, or I don't know if highlights is the right word. A couple other observations that jump out from the article.
Where's the good news?
Women lawyers. Now I do sound like Ron Burgundy. Who are mothers all too often face the conflicting societal and cultural demands of being a good mother who always puts her children and family first, while at the same time striving to be an ideal lawyer who has undivided career focus and a 24/7 commitment to her work. As a result of this dual expectation, data from the survey shows that attorneys who are mothers were more likely to be subject to disparaging comments about their ability and ambition, less access to business development and other career opportunities, lower compensation, lack of advancement, and other actions that sideline their careers. 61% of mothers surveyed indicated that they had dealt with demeaning comments about being a working parent, compared with 26% of fathers surveyed. I will say that I benefit from having my wife as the primary caregiver for our children, that enables me to do things, but I definitely feel like I benefit from this bias. Like when, because I'm fairly involved in my children's lives, but I feel like I definitely get credit for that, as if there's a lower bar for dads than there is for moms. And so, not that necessarily
People
ties
don't
directly
often
to our conversation, but
point out that you're a working dad.
Everyone
says, so are you a working dad, or?
Right.
I would like to be a stay-at-home dad. I've told my wife this many times, but the conversation hasn't gone as far as I'd like. So
sure. That's something that has always puzzled me. Is I get, you're a working mom, and no one. My husband works full time, and no one's like, well, he's also a working dad. He's just their dad. So I think it. You're spot on. It for sure can. The burden can be heavy.
Yeah. I think when I look at this type of commentary here and this type of study, to me, it illustrates a couple of things about what's broken. It speaks to, here's what the business model prizes. I mean, the business model prizes performance. And when there's a competing time demand, that's reflected in how people are able to advance. And I think it also speaks heavily to culture, because I look at the pressures that people's peers have placed on them. Rather shocking interaction that someone has of, hey, where do your loyalties lie? Are you going to be a mom, or are you going to be a good attorney for the firm? Which one are you going to pick? Whose side are you on? And then, the demeaning comments. There's another one in this article from somebody who was asked by one of their peers, and I've always been told you never ask, but they were asked by a male attorney in the firm, are you pregnant? And when they said, no, I'm not pregnant, it's like, oh, good. You'll have more time for work. Which is just, alarming to me that's the culture that some firms have created. So you have both of these kind of playing in tandem of the culture and the business model, I think really working together to where, in particular, it creates these kind of impacts on many people in the practice, working dads also, but in particular moms, because as data shows us heavily, moms have a disproportionate level of responsibility and expectations. And it shouldn't be that way, but it is. And so more of that work at home falls on them, which limits their ability to go to things like business development functions in the evening, limits the amount of capacity that they have for some of those other things, while continuing to define success around the scorecard that the firm perpetuates, which is go bill more hours and that'll lead to your advancement. Anyway, I've done too much talking. Somebody else say something.
I'll just say what's really interesting about this article is that the things that I have even seen and kind of this bias throughout even my own career, the commentary that's associated with it. But I would push it even farther, as far as in some legal environments that I've worked in, where I have seen, if there is a policy, for instance, of you're allowed to bring your kid to work for so many months after you have returned from maternity leave. I've seen, places where paternity leave is being started to be implemented, and maybe the dad does bring the baby to work rather than a mom. And what you see people just swoop in and say, oh my goodness, let me help you. As far as it relates to maybe a working mother who has the decision to do that and makes that choice, where you've seen the negative comments about the kid being at work. So I've witnessed that for my own eyes. And personally, I went through struggling at the very beginning of my career after I got married. What was I going to do? Because this was the reality that I knew was the culture of the practice of law. And here I am to this day. My husband's also a lawyer, and he chose to support me in my decisions in not having children right away. And I'm not afraid to say my age. I'm approaching 40 now, and I'm still struggling with thinking about this particular topic and making this decision, knowing that my time's probably running out and I need to make a decision as it relates to this. And it's a sad reality that I think many women faced when it comes to this aspect of the culture of the profession.
Yeah.
It is unbelievable I think the amount of progress that we as an industry could make if we allowed or created space for men to also be primary caregivers of children and be working dads. So not saying, well, your wife's taking a maternity leave, but what do you need, a couple days off? No, being a parent to a newborn baby is not primarily it is not just the duty of the person who grew the human from scratch, but also the other person, that may be a part of that relationship. And if we normalize men participating in these work and these actions, then it becomes less strange or less of a woman's responsibility. And it's she's going to come back from maternity leave. Or is she going to come back? Who knows? It's those types of things. And so I think one of the things that we have to do, and it feels kind of backwards when I talk to other people about it, but we have to tell men when they're having children, you need to take some time off and you need to go support your wife, support your baby. And even if you're feeling the pressure at work, feeling like I didn't have this baby, so I can't be home. You need to set the stage that says parental leave. As a parent, I'm going to take parental leave and I'm going to support my wife in the leave that she also has to take. Because when I had all three of my children, my husband was in different scenarios, but with the last baby, he had 12 weeks of leave and he took it. And it was powerful in the message that he was sending in his own work culture to say, I'm afforded 12 weeks of leave and I'm going to spend this time with my baby. And I think that moves the needle when men, it's not an easy choice for them either at all, but to legitimize needing to take time off for a baby, that it's not just a woman problem, but that it's a parent thing, that this is what parents do. And I think it is such a tough choice that professional women are having to make. And, you hear that commentary, you have to work like you don't have children, but you have to be a mom like you don't have a job. And it's like, I'm barely doing either of these things well. I'm trying to give it all and I'm just doing the best I can. And, my children aren't old enough to criticize me yet, but they're getting there. But yeah, it just, we've got to figure out how to move the needle in this area, because we're not seeing the rate at which women are going to law school. We're not seeing that matched rate in which women are being leaders at firms or being equity partners at firms, because somewhere in the middle we lose them, and that sucks.
Yeah. I think there's also another aspect to this, kind of to build on this topic of women's issues as it relates to a well-being aspect of it. Because the other thing that we don't often address, there's such stigma associated with mental health issues as it is, but then you want to add on to it the component of some of the more specific mental health conditions that women may experience just as a result of being women, particularly when you talk about stuff like postpartum, and how is that dealt with at the firm and within the firm culture, right? So a woman takes maternity leave, for the pregnancy, and then has a mental health condition in the afterwards. And, you've got that added pressure of, I got to get back to work because I already took the leave. So now I can't deal with this mental health issue that is significantly impacting me personally and professionally, and my ability probably to be my best self for my clients. But I just have to do the old, suck it up and go to work, because there's almost a double-edged sword of stigma that's associated with something such as postpartum.
Yes, totally. And, I think that is kind of more evident in the fact when we talk about identifying mental health as a health issue, not if you were diagnosed with, God forbid, cancer, people are going to rally around you and, what can I do? Can we provide meals? Take as much time as you need. When you have a baby, or are struggling postpartum, people are like, when are you coming back? When are you coming back? And you're like, what? I'm not sure. And so I think you're totally right. I think that the stigma around it, the mental health piece of it is still so important. And I think, too, when we talk about, how is the law broken in through this lens, and we think about what even big law, traditional law, using that word interchangeably, what they're saying about this, right? Because when they're recruiting, when they're, hiring female lawyers, doing those things, I cannot believe, not that I've, had this experience or been recruited by a bunch of big law firms, but that they're saying, actually, we hate babies and women, and we don't give time for maternity leave, and we think there's too many humans in the world as it is. I think that they're saying we have work-life balance. Our culture here is very family friendly. We want you to be successful here, and we, have this family-driven culture. And then what is the actual experience? What is the actual culture, or what is the experience for these people who are entering these law firms under the mindset that, oh, well, they've recruited me under these thoughts or under these principles, and then, it's a whole bamboozle. You're like, wow, look at that. I don't know if you have people talk about that being experienced, Danielle, in your work, that they were sold a bill of goods that they're like, wait a minute, this feels wrong.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I see that at all kind of different levels, big law, medium law, smaller firms, sure, where that is often a topic of discussion. And sometimes it's a struggle for people to make that decision as far as what's in their best interest, both professionally and personally. When you've signed on to work somewhere and it's what for some people that I work with, it's their very first job out of law school. And for some of them, it's hard to be empowered to say, you know what, I need something that's better, so I'm going to find something that's different. But that's a lot of the discussion as far as why I thought it was going to be something. But what I'm learning is that that's not the culture that I thought it was going to be.
On an individual level, I think the term is cognitive dissonance, when somebody has a set of beliefs that they ascribe to and then they don't act in accordance with those beliefs. Something that I've been pondering on this general topic is, what is the difference between a firm's stated culture and their actual culture? And how do those really come to be? And I'm curious for your thoughts, Danielle, and certainly Ashlyn as well. How often do firms of any size truly seem to live out their stated cultural values, and how often does that actually line up with their actual culture, or their true culture?
Right. You can go to a firm's website. Most have, their stated culture all over the place, on their website. It's a huge recruitment tool for new associates. But sometimes in reality, when you get there, what was stated at a very kind of surface level, right? We embrace DEIB, we embrace well-being practices. You get in and you start seeing the specifics, and the specifics don't line up with what the large bullet points were maybe on the website. And so for, newer associates, graduates, people looking to transition in and out of practice, looking beyond that website becomes extremely important, right? I often tell folks that are looking for jobs, right? It's your job to interview them just as much as it is for them to interview you. And having that understanding going into that process, I think is extremely helpful. But then the question becomes, well, then how do I navigate it? Because I go in for the interview process, but I'm being told maybe the same thing that's on the website. Right. And where I see particularly young lawyers run into problems is they don't have the connections yet in the legal community, right? To know who to call or who to talk to really figure out what that firm culture is. So I don't know about you all, but now I'm going to ask you a question. Do you have any recommendations for lawyers who struggle with that, who maybe haven't made the connections on the front end to figure out the culture of the firm?
Yeah, I think so. This is a question that a friend of mine shared with me that he used when he was picking a firm, and he was top of his class when he came out and had lots of options. But one of the questions he asked the firms he was interviewing with was, when was the last time you took a vacation? And I think that there's some of those questions to be prepared for going in if you want to determine a firm's culture, to think about, okay, what's a question I could ask where I might get an honest answer that would help me really test out, is this something that's real? So if a firm says, hey, we celebrate work-life balance, well, one way that should show up is in is on a vacation. How often does somebody take a vacation? Or when was the last time that you took time off and left your work phone at work or something like that? Just some of those questions to kind of get a sense of it. But I think that's also dangerous, or it can be dangerous for people who want to get in, and that's the top of their personal scorecard is, I got to get this job because I got to get into the workforce. And that there's some personal things that are just going to have to take a back seat to that. And I don't want to judge that decision. I just want to encourage folks that feel like they're in that place where they need to make it intentionally and to know what they're doing. Because I feel like where people get in trouble is they make that decision by lying to themselves without intentionality, and not being like, okay, I'm picking this and it's not reflective of my core long-term values, but it is truly a short-term decision, and this is what I am making it for, and I'm making it on purpose, and I'm making it to harmonize with my long-term values, and here's the end date. And I think that's really important. We've got to be honest with ourselves, and as somebody who has realized increasingly through adulthood that I'm really, really good at deceiving myself, or you had a better way of describing it that was much more kind earlier, Ashlyn. It was rationalizing behavior. I'll call it what I think it is. I lie to myself. But rationalizing through those short, quote unquote, short-term compromises, and then become long-term habits. And I think if people are really honest with themselves about, here's what I want, here's why I'm making this decision, but then put an end date on it. And I think that that's critical. And then I really liked your reference to, they don't have the connections. A lot of people don't have the connections to either test out and extrapolate, hey, this is what the website says, but what is it really? I think, go to your law professors, say, hey, who's somebody you trust that's going to know, or do you have direct knowledge? What is it really like? I just really want to know, without somebody thinking, oh, well, they don't want to work hard, because I am going to work hard. That's why I'm here. But I'm also going to have really good boundaries, and I'm going to be a healthy person. But then I think people need to network hard. Because on another episode, Janet mentioned something that I thought was really, really good. Sometimes people don't have options because they don't have access, and they haven't been provided access. And I think that that's something to be really, really intentional about, is go create your own access. And that might be through, creating relationships with partners at other law firms or associates at other law firms, start to build your own book of business, do all those things, create your own access. Because if you have access, you have options. So I think that that's part of how I think about it.
Yeah, I am speaking from a place of privilege here, having,
Mm-hmm.
and I recognize that. But I think truly, we talked in an episode about modeling behavior, right? I think the way that we can identify whether who's interviewing us, and we're talking about stated culture versus actual culture, is can we see the people who we're interacting with, whether it be on this interview or on a callback or anything, can they model the level of vulnerability we're willing to share with them? Because I think there's strength in lawyers being able to just show an ounce of themselves, of their human nature. And so really, if you've made the decision that you need to get this job because it is what it is. I wholly respect that and have been there and made decisions like that. But when you're really being thoughtful about finding a good fit culture-wise, and you want to see whether the stated culture is the actual culture, really see if you start to share or be your authentic self, or, show up to those interviews being who you are, see if that's returned to you in kind. And if you're met with, very robotic behavior or behavior that's not matching your energy, then you can kind of be like, okay, well, your culture said that you were fun, but this is not fun. So actually, and I've ended an interview and said, hey, I'm not sure that we're a good fit, and that's okay. And it just, I don't think that I'm what you're looking for, and that's okay too. I think if you prioritize those types of things, it takes a whole lot of confidence, and it's not easy to do. And again, some access to give you the privilege of being able to make some tough choices, for sure.
I have one last thought to add, and it's a particular kind of question, and it takes you need to prepare this kind of question in advance, and so have a sense of what are the values that you want to test in an interview process. But we've all been in those rooms where it's like, hey, I have a friend who has a problem, right? And everybody knows that you're talking about themselves. So it's in that same genre, if you will, but asking it like this, like, hey, have if you had an associate that was trying to leave and they were, expressing concern about work-life balance, how would you convince them to stay? Because I think if you ask it in that way of how do you convince somebody to stay who's expressing a concern, I think if you ask a question like that, it depersonalizes it. So it makes it not necessarily about you as the applicant, but it also attacks it from a different angle that an interviewer might not be thinking about exactly how you're. And so you might get a more candid answer. Right. On something like that. I've asked that kind of a question in scholarship interviews where it was some scholarships for folks that were, long-term Kansas residents. And so it was, hey, instead of asking like, are you committed to staying and practicing law in Kansas, where everyone knows the credited response, the only response, and dear God, you better not give a different one, is, yes, I will be here till my ashes decay in the ground, is to ask it a little bit differently of, hey, if you had a friend who was talking about, who loved Kansas and was talking about leaving the state to practice somewhere else, how would you convince them to stay? Because I think I think it's a little bit more useful of a question, and it gets a little bit more creative of a response. So does that answer your question, Danielle?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get both of your thoughts on, we talk about, stated culture versus actual culture, and we're talking about these different things and talking them in theory, but it's a two-part question. So in your thoughts and experiences, how would you describe common or typical stated culture in sort of the traditional law model? And then a follow-up to that is, would you describe the actual culture the same way in a traditional law firm in the sense that we've been talking about it, or how would you describe both those things? And Sam, you have to go first.
Oh, I do? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm so glad you asked. Mm-hmm. I'm very prepared for this question. So I think the typical stated culture is going to be things like what you'll find if you look at almost any big law website, which is we prize excellence, we prize service, we prize our team, we prize and value diversity, equity, inclusion. We prize community, and so integrity, a lot of very non-surprising things when it comes to stated culture. I think when I look at things like actual culture, I think the values that seem to rise to the top are We value maximizing your productivity from a billable hour and a billable dollar standpoint. We value and prioritize people that are willing to do anything and everything that the client asks whenever they want and are constantly available. People need to be always on and always available. We value and prioritize being at the absolute top of everyone's priority list at all times, to the exclusion, I think, of all other things. I think that those are some animating characteristics that I see from an actual cultural perspective. I mean, I'm sure there's others, but those are some of the things that come to my mind to start with.
Yeah. What about you, Danielle?
Yeah, Sam, the whole, availability aspect of things is one that's huge that commonly comes up in my conversation with lawyers who may be thinking about leaving. And what's interesting in that regard is when I have those conversations, I'll ask, is this the actual culture? Is this stated culture? Like, why is it that this is your perception that you have to be on all of the time? And I think in some ways, you're going to have those firms that, yes, that's actual expectation and it's very clear. But I think in other instances, what I have seen is, lawyers tell me, well, I really don't know. I kind of just assumed that. Part of that is behavior, right?
Yeah.
What we see out of everybody else, our colleagues around us. But the other aspect of that, I think, is this sort of what we've been talking about this whole time, this long-standing tradition, where maybe instead of stated culture, maybe we don't have statements about it at all.
Right.
And so all we have is just kind of what we see from everybody. But then you got people who have these kind of assumptions because this has been the tradition that we have come to know to where, maybe this isn't what the firm is really wanting, but they just haven't had actual conversations about what they want their culture to be. So I think that's another aspect of this. You're going to have those that fall into the category of, we're going to state this on the website to attract our associates that we want to attract to our firm. But I think you're going to have this other set of firms who've never actually really had conversations about it and ask themselves the question, what is our culture that we actually want to embrace within our law firm? And when we don't ask that question and we don't define it, then what immediately creeps in is those assumptions that are related to the traditional law practice.
Yeah. There's a way of describing it in leadership literature, and I'm going to mangle it here, but you have the culture that you either create or you permit. And I think that's where a lot of law firms are, is they haven't created an intentional, purposeful culture. And I'm really glad you pointed that out of there's all these assumptions that have just stacked up over time. This is the way we've always done it. We've got this long standing set of habits that just get passed down from generation to generation with very little modification. And then they just get replicated, down the line without anybody stopping and going like, hey, is this what we actually want to be about? And then that's what their culture just kind of becomes through inaction, and not because there's some central, committee going like, hey, let's have a culture where people don't feel like they can unplug on vacation. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we'll fix it with a sabbatical.
Right. 3 months.
In 7 years.
Once you earn it. I think that's such an incredible point, and not one that I'd thought through, Danielle, but as I'm sitting here listening to you talk, as a young lawyer, I remember going into my first review meeting with my comp committee and thinking, oh my gosh, I've made a list of all of the things I'll do better next year. And I'm prepared to defend myself about my value here. And I swear, there are reasons for these things. And I sit down and they're like, Ashlyn, killer year. And I'm like, what? But here's all the things that I didn't do well, or that the metrics that I don't feel like I met. And some of this is on the responsibility of maybe I'm the only person in this room that has this sort of type A personality of achievement, where I've projected what the law firm expects of me. And because they haven't clearly stated or haven't clearly communicated, I've just decided that I'm not meeting those needs or meeting those standards. And so no one has told me I'm not doing well. No one has told me I'm not meeting metrics. But in my mind, it's not good enough. And so some of this, I think, could be alleviated by, some I don't know whether it's confidence training or what we can do for young lawyers to say, if you don't know what the culture is where you're going to work, start asking, start looking, start trying to, but also give yourself some grace that you don't have to engage in this sort of hustle all of the time. And Danielle, I just think it was so spot on for you to say when they're not telling you what your culture is, you adopt it, you project it, and then you just get in the rat race. And then, you wake up 30 years later and you're like, oh, whoops.
Yep.
Yeah.
Here we are.
Here
Same
we
place.
are. Yep. Oopsie.
I'm curious, what do you think is the interaction for both of you? What do you think is the interaction between a firm's business model and its culture? Particularly as it relates to the experience that's created for attorneys and other folks that work in the law, but under this broader vein of, observing that the traditional approach to law is broken. For a little bit of added context, when I think about it, and I think it's important for all of our listeners and viewers to adopt my way of thinking about it, just so everyone's clear.
We should lay that in the intro, groundwork here. It is important and imperative that we all initially agree with Sam.
If you want to know if your thoughts are right, just ask me what mine are, and then if yours are different, then you'll know that you're wrong. Oh, dear God. Can we edit that out?
Nope.
We should probably leave that in. Someone please clip that and shame me with it later. If anyone needs sarcasm text, if they're reading a transcript, this is the sarcasm font.
This is in italics.
The way I've thought about this is that so much of what's created is a result of incentives. Mm-hmm. And we as humans respond to incentives. We respond to cultural incentives through a desire to fit in, to be part of a tribe, to be part of a community, to perform as expected, to integrate, to assimilate. So we respond to those incentives and also our own internal desires to have and belong to a place that harmonizes with our own personal values. And so I think that's the cultural side of things. And then I think there's the business model side of things, which is, I would almost rate those on like a different level from a hierarchy of needs standpoint, if you will, that things like, hey, I've got to survive, so I've got to go make money. I've got to advance so that I can climb the hill. And so in order to advance, I've got to perform according to these different ways. So this is how I'm compensated. This is how I advance. This is how I achieve status and all these other things. And so I think of those two components as being related, but creating these really strong, potentially really strong sets of incentives that then creates behavior. And it's the behavior that then creates and perpetuates either the traditional model or a new model and so on and so forth. And so I'm curious for both of you as you think about the interconnectedness of business model and culture. Do you see them as being really that connected? And what kind of role, if you do, or if you don't, what kind of role do you think that they play in creating and perpetuating what we see in traditional law?
I think they're very much interconnected and can definitely impact one another equally. And I think for me, what comes to mind, a good example of that is, the yearly review opportunity and maybe what's incentivized through the business model and culturally there through that process. And who are the associates that firms may be looking at because of their business model of looking at books, right? How many clients did you have? How many new clients did you bring into the firm this year? What is your billable hour? And those may be the things that through the review process where you're going to reward somebody when you are going through that versus why are we not maybe reviewing or rewarding something that's more culturally related? Mm-hmm. Like, do you have good emotional intelligence skills with your clients? How are your relationships, right? Some of those more soft skills that we don't talk about because we talk more about the traditional model of how we incentivize employment when those things are just as valuable. And those things, if not even more, perpetuate your culture. So even when it comes down to that process, I would say those two things are very interconnected. And that's just a small example when you start talking about business model and firm culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I would even go so far as to say that your business model is probably what drives your culture, even if it doesn't match what your stated culture is. So if your business model you reward the behavior that you want, and that is just human beings 101. Even dogs, that's how you train dogs as well, but also humans, is that you see behavior that you like and then you reward it. And then you see more behavior that you like and you reward that. And then we are all sort of trying to get rewarded for behavior. And if all that we're rewarding in money talks, it just does in terms of how we're incentivizing people who are showing up to work. We have to incentivize it. We have to spend money incentivizing behavior that we prioritize or that we want our firms to see, or the culture that we want to have. And if all we're incentivizing or rewarding is production, and it's a business, I understand that production is important as a business owner. But if that's what we're rewarding, then that's what's driving our culture, is a need to produce. And most, if not all firms, at least any statement of culture that I've read, don't say, our culture is about production. We just want you to make us all money, and make yourself some money along the way. And maybe we would respect the hell out of that. But no, usually it's like, we want excellence. Well, great. We want excellence in production. So I think they're inexplicably connected. I think one drives the other. And then I think culture just, tries to keep up.
Danielle, I'm curious, which one do you think is stronger, culture or business model? And if you say it depends, you get points. I don't know what the points are redeemed for, but if you can work that in, and the more times you can work it in, yeah.
Right. I'm going to lean towards culture. And the reason why I say that is because I think that aspect of how we treat one another, because when I think about culture, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. How do we treat each other? How do we treat each other as colleagues? And how do we treat our clients? It becomes particularly important. We want to go back to how we're interconnected. Our culture with our clients ultimately impacts our business model and bottom line. And these things can sometimes be very circular in nature. And I think if you build a strong, positive culture that creates environments, right, that produces lawyers who feel like they have strong well-being, that can then increase their competence, who can then provide great services for their clients, and create those really good relationships. What's the potential impact? Those clients go out and say, hey, I had a really great experience with this firm. And so the added benefit to that is then hopefully what that does is that also increases your referral rate. It increases your reputation within the legal community and within your community in which you are situated with, which will then ultimately impact your business model.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good answer.
It is a good answer.
Yeah. What do you think, Ashlyn?
Ask the question again.
Which do you think is stronger, business model or culture, for most firms? Because of course there's always going to be differences.
Which do I think is, you mean like the stronger in the sense of the most prevalent? Like what are people experiencing the most?
Or which one do you think creates the strongest drive and set of incentives in terms of creating what a firm becomes? And the experience it creates for people.
I think it depends.
You get points.
Yay, I love points. I think in a lot of situations, in a lot of scenarios, I think that culture can do the trick. I think if you have a culture that people respond well to, they are willing to put up with a lot more or experience a lot more or even give more if they are working in a place where they feel rewarded and valued and seen and like they belong. And so I think in a lot of instances, culture can be a very powerful driving force. I think when we talk about law firm business model, though. I do think that the business model, where the dollar comes from, how the dollar gets counted, and then whose dollar it is, I think all of those things will continue to drive whether that culture is real or not. Does that make sense? So both. How's that?
Yeah, that's a good answer. So I'm going to cover all the bases, and I'm going to say that I think business model is stronger. I think, well, the reason I feel that way is because of where I think it creates the most impact. And I think it creates the most impact at the very beginning of an attorney's career. Because I think when folks, and this kind of tacks on to one of our other conversations, and I think when people come out of law school and they're directly going into the practice of law, their first experience is going to be very, very formative on them, of course. But that's the time when people are coming out with, in many cases, huge amounts of student loan debt. So they've got that incredible financial pressure. They're starting to think about all of the cultural and social expectations around, okay, I got to go buy a house in a nice neighborhood. I got to be able to prepare to go put my kids in private school. I got to do all these other things. And so all of those things, especially in 2023, when my food bill is now $5,000 a day.
Yes. I had too many kids. If I'd known the economy was going to go in this direction.
Have y'all seen the price of Halloween candy? Good Lord.
That's why we gave out extra Costco-sized fruit snacks, but in this economy?
We went trick-or-treating and we just asked for fresh produce.
Like, do you have any eggs? We don't want your candy.
I am looking for, do you have a can of organic non-GMO? Yeah. So I think that creates a lot of pressure on people to maximize their outcomes through optimizing their experience under the business model. And the business model has very clear, for a lot of people that are coming from a place of, hey, I got grades, and I got instant feedback. Culture often doesn't give you really tangible instant feedback, but business models often do. If I get this many billable hours, I get the feedback of I make my bonus. If I do this, I make partner, or if I do whatever. But so I think it creates more clear incentives, and I think it creates incentives that speak most closely to the pain points and the pressures that attorneys feel most strongly early in their careers. And I think that forms and drives a lot of behavior. I think that is then perpetuated longer term, because as soon as people drink enough of the Kool-Aid, I'm being very cynical here. I want everyone to know I'm baseline a very optimistic and hopeful person.
That's true.
But I think as soon as people drink enough of the Kool-Aid, then it's like it's just inside of them now. It's not like you get in, 6, 7, 8 years after having committed to that process of, earning those dollars, trading those billable hours for hopefully those things on the personal side that you value a great deal. And then you just shut it off and go, okay, now I can go do what I really value, what I really prioritize. I think at that point, you've had to make those moral justifications to convince yourself of that. And I think that what that in many instances ends up doing is creating something where the business model causes the culture to conform to the business model. And then in essence, the culture begins to reflect the business model. And so I think in many firms, the culture has become just a reflection. It's just become the mirror showing us what the business model actually is. Because of what we've allowed. And I think some of that goes back to what you commented on earlier, Danielle, about, there's all these unstated things because many people are not thinking intentionally and being thoughtful about like, hey, what if we design our work differently? What if we had a culture on purpose? I think where that can be really different is where people with privilege, people with power, people with authority make really intentional decisions and commit to a longer term process to say like, no, our culture is what we're going to choose to value most. And we're going to make our business model be the mirror and reflect our culture rather than the other way around. Because I think,
yeah.
Because I think go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you on that part, right? It's going to take people with power and privilege to put culture first and let that shape their business model. But I think what's interesting about it is that if we allow for a culture that is collaborative and we allow for a culture that gives safety in speaking up and speaking out and questioning or asking, the whys or the hows, so to speak, to start conversations, then what I think that can spark then is something that would be of benefit to the firms, which is you get collaboration and feedback. You have the opportunity to be innovative because of that collaboration, particularly if maybe you're somebody that has been there really long term and you're used to doing things the way we've always done them.
Yeah.
Allowing for those open conversations gives opportunity for learning, I think, both ways.
Yeah.
So, firms that want to make changes, I think looking at both your business model, but then really diving into what you want your culture to be can set you up, I think, for more success should you want to change that business model.
Yeah. No, I think that's so well put. I think so many people feel like it's an either or. I've got to either pick my business model or pick my culture. And if I pick my culture, I'm not going to have good financial outcomes. I'm going to sacrifice. And I think from your experience, and you've captured it so well here, and you referenced it earlier, and I hate to be this guy because I don't want to sound like Pollyanna. I promise I'm not. But truly, I believe this, that when you do the right thing and you commit to it over time, good things happen. I mean, you create these virtuous cycles where doing the right thing causes you to retain the top talent who takes care of the best clients, who then, drive the financial performance of the firm. And it just creates this cycle that perpetuates itself. And I love that. I think it's one of the great, inspirations or hopes that I have, is that people will start to see that, and that they'll listen to you, and that they'll listen to the data, they'll listen to the experiences and the observations, that when people really commit to doing the right things, to doing those, to making those hard short-term choices, they really truly get those, amazing long-term results. Yep. Well, as we close out today's episode, first off, Ashlyn and Danielle, I want to thank you so much for, just bringing so many wonderful thoughts and observations to this conversation. I'm really challenged by a number of your observations and comments on things. I'm going to be really mulling on a number of them for a while and thinking about how I can do a better job, modeling for our team at Foreman Law, and how I can just continue to try to keep improving what we're doing from a culture and a business model perspective. But as we close out today's episode, what are some key thoughts or challenges or tips that you have, each of you, for folks as they're listening today?
Yeah, I think this time around, I'm going to give a tip for firms, and that is to ask yourselves the question, what is your culture? Because so often, as we identified today in this episode, oftentimes maybe we don't know, we haven't asked those questions. And so I think really taking a dive into that can help you along the way, developing that business model, retaining your work culture. So I highly encourage, if you haven't done it, do it. And then if you do it, be open to feedback, and be open to feedback from all the generations within your firm, because that's going to ultimately be the way that you're going to have the ability to change that culture, is by listening.
No, that's great.
Yeah. Mine is a challenge to probably both lawyers who are parents, and successfully modeling that or engaging in that at their law firms. I would really challenge them to share the level of work and sacrifice and the variety of things it takes to do both well, vulnerably and openly with those that are on your team or that you're recruiting. Because just like Instagram or social media, when we only see the parts of it that are working, we are made to feel like, why is it so easy for them and it's not easy for me? And why are these parents such successful lawyers and partners at law firms and I can't even get my kids dressed in the morning? And the more that is, working moms, but even working dads just normalize the idea that this is difficult. It's difficult to practice law by itself. It's difficult to practice law and raise a family. All of these things are tough things, but normalizing that it's not easy and allowing and creating space for people to learn from your experience, or at least acknowledge that, it doesn't look the way it always looks on Instagram. I'm getting ready to post our family photos, and I must always share. Before we took these photos, I threatened a lot of harm to everyone in them. So know that we look like we have it together, but truly this was a work of art on our photographer's part. And I think it's important to be transparent and realistic about what it takes to get there.
No, that's great. My tip is to take 15 minutes and find somebody who doesn't have access and create access for them. So much of, I think, breaking free from the traditional model is giving people the ability to leave, giving them the ability to say no to things. And if people aren't in a position where they have enough freedom, enough flexibility, enough confidence to go like, hey, I can reach out to somebody in another firm and say, are you hiring in this area? And know that that's a conversation I can have in safety and confidence. Or if they don't have a book of their own business, or they don't have any of these other things that are going to even allow them to entertain the conversation with themselves about, hey, what would it look like if I decided that this place is toxic and the best thing for me and my family is I'm going to go somewhere else? If they don't even have the ability to start that conversation, they're just going to remain there. And you have the opportunity, we all have the opportunity to look for those people and go, I can just do something really simple to create access. I can invite them to this board meeting. I can invite them to meet this client with me. I can help make an introduction for them to help create access and start that process moving. And you can do it in 15 minutes with an email. So
I love it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on today's episode as we've talked in more depth about a lot of things, but in particular how the traditional approach to law is broken. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We're excited to continue it with you in the episodes to come. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.